Hello everyone. In this section we're going to be covering creating custom attributes. So what's a custom attribute? Well, first thing is these are our basic attributes on any transform object: translate, rotate, scale, and visibility. But if we look at our attribute editor, we have all these other attributes too. And these are attributes that are provided for the objects in our scene, and there's going to be a lot for different things. If it's shaders or if it's transforms or groups and everything, they all have different attributes that are provided for us. But in rigging, we're going to have to create a lot of attributes that are not going to be provided. Things that we want to create for ourselves, like IKFK switches. That's not something that this system might have. So I'm going to create an attribute and make my connections for it. So this is a vital step in rigging, is knowing how to create your own custom attributes. So where are my custom attributes? Well, if I go to edit in the channel box, we have all these different attribute tools: adding, editing, duplicating. Actually, duplicating is terrible, but we go to add attribute and we get this little box. Now, I really don't like this little menu because we're going to see in the future it kind of makes us a lot of extra work every time we go through it. So the first thing is I need a long name. Now, when we're naming an attribute, for one thing, you cannot put spaces. So I typed in index curl and I put an underscore in between index and curl. You can completely do camel case, which is actually uppercase in the first word of the next, the first letter of the next word. And that's completely fine. Matter of fact, Maya does this naming convention, and it's completely cool with that. So I do index curl like this. I just like this naming better. So I'm by default on float, which means it has a decimal point, and I'm going to say add. And you'll notice one thing: right when I hit add, it clears off, and it will reset everything in here. And this is why I really don't like this menu. But if I click on index curl and I middle mouse drag, you see I got an attribute. Now at this point, this attribute does nothing. We will eventually use set-driven keys, direct connections, expressions, all those different type of things to make these attributes do things. But at this point, we're just creating like placeholders for them right now that we'll eventually use later. Okay, so how do I get rid of this attribute? Well, I go to edit, and now I have delete attributes in the channel box, of course. So I delete that. So now let's look at our data types. So now I'm going to type in geometry viz underscore viz. So let's say this was an attribute to control the visibility of our geometry. I could click integer because this is normally a 0 or 1. So I could say add. And now you can see I have my values. And it don't have any decimal points because you're not going to, in visibility, have a partial visibility. Now you probably noticed that it's really irritating to have to go, you only want 0 and 1 instead of actually 22. So how do I change that? Well, I'm going to delete this one again. And delete attribute. Okay, so if I want to do a range, let's go back to index curl, and I go back to float, and I can type in -10 on minimum, maximum is 10, and default is 0. And when I hit add, you see, wipes out everything again. Now I click, and I can go between these. And you see we get a decimal point value on this. Good. Most times, you're going to be creating float attributes. Okay, so what if I accidentally put min and max range, or did not put this on and I want to edit it later? Well, with the attribute selected, I can go into edit and I can say edit attribute. Now, actually, you don't really have to worry about which attribute is selected because you still got to select it again with this menu. So I select my custom attribute and I could say, hey, it has a min or max. I could say, hey, this is supposed to be 0. And this is all on the fly. I still have the attribute selected and I can middle mouse drag, and you see how it doesn't go past 0. Or I can turn the min and max off completely, and you see how it goes from there. So you can change it after the fact. The only thing is it's irritating if you have to do some multiples. You got to select in each one and change them. So I do normally create them by default right at the start. The last thing I want to cover here is we do have a Boolean type, which actually does true and false. I'm not a huge fan of this because you can't middle mouse drag. It says on or off type of thing, and it does take 0 and 1. So I normally use integer instead of Boolean because it can middle mouse drag, and 0 and 1. Everybody pretty much understands that's true and false. We're going to cover enum in a different a different podcast. But mainly, the last thing I want to cover is you got to be careful that you don't try to create attributes with the same name. So if I open up my script editor, you don't have to open it, you'll see this. And I'm going to type in index curl again in here. Now, the naming is very specific. So if I did a capital I for index, it probably would be okay, which it's not okay. It just would be like, okay, I'm dealing with that. So if I'm going to move this over here so you see it happen. I hit add, and it screams at me and says, index curl already exists with all that line. So this is one thing you got to be very careful that you are creating custom attributes. And that's pretty much for this podcast.